Good morning, everyone. From New Haven to Cleveland and from Richmond to Louisville, this is Free Atlantic Radio, the voice of the Northeastern nation. I am your host, Tom Kaczynski. I want to thank you for joining with me. Today's date is Wednesday, August 19th, 2020, although I am actually recording this on Tuesday, so if I'm a day ahead of the news cycle, you'll have to forgive me. I'm just trying to get through a couple things today. But I want to thank everyone who listens to the show. Reminder, all episodes are available at free-atlantic-radio.castos.com. Check out our sister show with the excellent work by Kanaz Filan and John Q. Publius at free-atlantic-voices.castos.com, or all of these podcasts are available under the names that we used on Apple iTunes, Google Play, and other fine podcasters throughout the web. So, I want to also remind people, want to show support for the program. The Venmo is at CVCPRV. Thank you very much for those who help. You help keep this program afloat. We need you. The email is newalbion@protonmail.com. The Twitter is at Atlantic_Nation. And the last bit is the address is P.O. Box 35, Greenville Junction 04442. So today's episode, I get asked a lot of questions in the mailbag, and I haven't had the chance to give full credence to all of them like I want because I have been a very busy boy. Wouldn't you like to know doing what? But I do want to talk about a broader question that comes to what a lot of people ask about in the mailbag. And one of the wonderful and unexpected delights of Free Atlantic Radio is we actually have a very large listener base who exist outside of our borders, whether they be people in Florida, Alabama, California, Washington, British Columbia, and I want to say hello to everyone, as well as our friends around the world outside the United States and the Dominion of Canada. So today's episode is really set up a little bit for you guys, so we can expand our reach just a little bit, because although my focus is upon the issues of the world and the countries that affect the greater Northeast, what I want to do is offer a little bit of cultural understanding and a background in nationalism you probably won't get anywhere else. Now, when I'm not busy playing your humble host and provocateur of the radio, what I would say is that I've been known to write a book or two, and for those who are unfamiliar with my work, you might want to go check them out on Amazon. For instance, my book, The Coming Civil War, has actually been an incredibly popular book that's probably one of the most purchased, if not the most purchased, manuals to explain what is coming and its sequel, Incoming, Red Lines and Hot Takes for the Coming Civil War, actually predicted much of what we are dealing with now, and when I wrote it last year, even though it looked during the COVID crisis we were going into a different world. What's interesting is how quickly the big elites in the country, as to say the corporate and media establishment, or what we should call the private propaganda influence industry, went out there and pulled the narrative right back to where it wanted to, starting with the issues with George Floyd, which, by the way, if anyone's been following that, I know most people haven't, it has become clear in evidence that, in fact, he was heavily influenced by fentanyl in his system, and that probably played a key role in his death, which happened, and from which all these other events spawned. So, once again, the facts don't connect to what happened on the ground, and I'm certainly not endorsing the methodology of the Minneapolis Police Department, but yeah, it was actually their standard existing procedure what Derek Chauvin did, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because we've gotten to the point where political reality, as is often the case, is divorced from actual reality. Nonetheless, today's purpose is not to complain about the idiocy of Black Lives Matter or Antifa, because I think we all agree that every life has value. That's not a questioned issue. But the idea that you have anti-fascists, as they're so called in the streets, well, if those of you who are up in Portland, whom the rest of us look upon with sad wonder and, frankly, revulsion, what you're allowing to happen up there, and I'm thinking specifically of Mayor Ted Wheeler, I'm thinking of Governor Kate Brown, and it's a debacle, honestly, and it's a sorry situation of a civilization that doesn't want to defend itself. But it actually isn't entirely your fault, and today's episode is sort of rooted in that. But, as we do it, I just have to draw a note to there's some videos out there. Andy NGO, if you look him up on Twitter, has incredible coverage that has been covering what happened in Portland, not last night, but the night previous, where a gentleman was pulled from his car and beaten, and he was actually kicked in the back of the head. There were reports circulating that the gentleman may have died. It appears as of this moment that is not correct. But I do know he was kicked in the head from behind, epithets were screamed at him, and he's trying to defend a woman from being beat up. And these are your peaceful protesters. So let's call them what they are: rioters and insurrectionists who are paid for by the corporate establishment and who are enabled by the government because they're designed to create a certain level of unrest. And they're actually working, although I don't know if the people who support them are going to like it. They're going to do something utterly remarkable, which is to ensure Donald Trump's reelection, which itself is kind of curious, and we could go down rabbit holes as to why that should happen, but you see the numbers tightening because, as it turns out, people don't want to actually live in a country whose government functions with the efficacy of Somalia. And I imagine for all the people in Oregon who, whenever they leave their Portland bubble, as you see the suburbanites come out in numbers, armed to the teeth, kicking those people out, the idea that these controlled burns of the cities will be allowed to go anywhere else is utterly absurd. And you can actually see evidence of this. And I probably will cover it on Friday, actually, because it's worth covering, absent a major news break, that will look at where people are moving and how cities are dying. I know the two cities in America which are dying most quickly are New York City and San Francisco. I suspect Portland, Seattle, and Chicago are in the second tier. And why is that the case? Well, it turns out people don't like governors, or I shouldn't say governors, mayors, who decide that they're going to put propaganda ahead of public safety. And the idea that you're just going to let that happen led to the resignation of Seattle Police Chief Carmen Best, if I remember her name correctly. And this is what we've been seeing out there. And I generally try not to comment on what's happening too much in other places like that, just because I'm trying to focus more on the Atlantic, although I will say Lori Lightfoot has done an utterly abysmal job in Chicago, in our region, as well as Bill de Blasio single-handedly wrecking New York City is an interesting outcome. And the fact that the New York Police Department, which has been incredibly successful in keeping safety in that city, it is being removed, is very distressing to the many good people of New York, including some who listen to this show. So I want you to know we haven't forgotten about you in Brooklyn, in Queens, whatnot. My mother was from Flushing, so I'm thinking about you. And we want to see you liberated from a government that's seeing you under the reign of terror. And that's what we're dealing with. We are dealing with a reign of terror, and people need to be aware of that. And that terror is there because of people who are afraid stop thinking. When you stop thinking, things can be done to you. And whether those reflexive actions will be used for government to have authority in a left or right context is pretty easy to predict as a social commentator, that as things get worse, you will allow government to do more, and that's probably what this is about. Same way that terrorism, an act of terrorism in 9/11 led to the Patriot Act, which destroyed the Fourth Amendment. The fears over COVID, the fears over rioting in the streets is going to enable a police surveillance state that people will probably support just because they want problems to go away. And this is one of the challenges you face as a citizen when you have a hostile government. And I would argue we do have a hostile government in the sense that it allows that sort of pressure to be put on you. You're not supposed to feel free and capable and able, whether it be at the state level or the federal level, whomever you're talking about across parties. There seems to be a universal push these days to lay the pressure cooker in deep and put you in a hard spot to survive. And we're all feeling it, whether it be the economy, where 40 million plus are still unemployed and many people are unemployed, including the fact that the government can't even figure out how to provide basic support, and Congress left. I think that's utterly unconscionable, and it's just one more example of the abdication of power we have seen from Washington. Whether it is the violence in the streets and the fact that many governors and mayors have actually decided to abrogate their responsibility to their very taxpayers, to the many small businesses, that the millions of apolitical people out there who have no interest other than being able to call 911 and have someone show up and provide safety for them. Those services are becoming unwieldy and unmanageable, and that's intentional. Why? Because then they want to go ahead and redefine what it means to have security and control. So, taken in sum, what you see is the creation of a new order, and as you see these things being pushed around the world where America looks a lot like China, one might call it conspiratorially the New World Order. And what is that? It is a global entity that is designed to homogenize the way people live across borders, whether it be through common trade standards, a standard relationship of the citizen to the state, or the understanding that international institutions which are not accountable to the citizens will be the people responsible for making decisions about how people will live. That has been most of human history, most of the world. In the United States and Canada, and within the British Dominions more broadly, there has been much more leniency in that, and that is part of the story today where we're going to pick this up. Before we understand the New World Order, we need to understand the old order that we have here, and I don't mean the old order of Europe where elites made the decisions and people served as serfs, and whether they were, the true serfs that you had in Eastern Europe or whether you were on a latifundia in Italy, that was generally the way. But there were ideas of freedom that came out of the northern countries, Scandinavian traditions, German traditions, into the into England and Scotland, I should say, and some of those have wandered their way to the New World. So let's talk about the three major regions of this North American continent for U.S. and Canada. Mexico's its own thing, interesting in its own right, actually, but beyond the scope of today's discussion. So the United States has three mega regions, the North, the South, and the West. And I want to offer you my perspective because I think it's novel on what defines each of those regions and what are the key elements of it. And we'll start with the Northeast, which we'll call the North. And the borders of the North, just so you understand, historically, the North went from the Mason-Dixon line, which is the dividing line between Pennsylvania and Maryland. Maryland used to be a southern state. It is now a northern state because of the movements of people. But it went from there to include elements of West Virginia along the Ohio River going westbound, and I would argue the western border of it is actually probably the Missouri River. So let's call that the North. And for the purposes of conversation, just so you know, the South is those areas that are south of it, although I would argue based on migration and economy, that line actually exists now at the Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee border, which carries through, by the way, as a north-south divide that we see not just within the United States, but internationally, where different climates work differently in terms of how people live. It's well understood in traditional history, which was very good, by the way, as a craft up until about 1960, when they moved toward this idea that they were going to insert political propaganda, i.e. Marx's universal laws of history, which weren't right for the first 150 years either, that there was this geographic component, right? If you live in a cold weather environment, different stresses by nature put on people, reason people to different conclusions. So if you're living in the swampers of Alabama, you are not going to live the same as you live in the snows of Michigan. And that makes perfect sense that your life cycle follows the seasons, your economy works in those ways, and people organize differently, especially in a pre-technological society, or at least pre-industrial revolution, where it was not possible to live as insulated from the seasons. So literally, you could not live the same sort of life as you would go ahead and live in a northern climate versus a southern climate. Nonetheless, we're just drawing lines on the map now so you can visualize it. So the South continues into probably somewhere, between the Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas line. And at that point, Texas is kind of a unique, weird amalgam. We're going to call it the South for today's case. But El Paso, put it this way, Houston is a southern city and El Paso is a western city. And the West consists of the Rocky Mountains westward to the Pacific Ocean. And I would argue there's two separate kind of groups in there, which is the Mountain West is one way of looking at things, and the coastal areas. And of course, there are sub-regions. So let's leave those aside for the moment, but just drawing a map in your mind. So each of these regions was settled by different groups of people who had different ideas about how to live, and those ideas got really developed deeply. Here in the North, what I have said is in a single word, if you had to describe what the North is all about, it's about order. and it manifests in different ways. And so why do I say order? If you study the history of New England, and I have as much as anyone you're going to find, believe me, I have a thick stack of books about Puritanism. It would make most people cry, although I actually find it really interesting. I find Jonathan Edwards' sermons refreshing and inspiring. The idea upon which New England was founded, whether you look at William Bradford in Massachusetts, the Plymouth Bay Colony, whether you look at Roger Williams' efforts in Connecticut, or Anne Hutchinson, any of these people who were up here, what you would find, or even going a little further south, William Penn in Pennsylvania, in a more tolerant sense, you can look at these different states that made up this region, and this was an idea of that the right social order created a better man, and the better man led to salvation. So what was once Puritanism has over time evolved into progressivism in the Northeast. But it fundamentally, you have to understand when you look at Northern culture, and this is important for the Atlantic nation. You guys need to understand this. This is the key to understanding us, and why, in fact, you don't see the left and right fighting in the same way in the North that they do in the South, or that you do and especially in the West. The West has a lot of problems we'll have to get into. But in the North, this idea exists that, the question isn't about having the ideology perfect. Up until about 2017, 2018, Maine, as an example, or New Hampshire or Vermont, states with very different backgrounds. And just to put it clear for those who aren't familiar, Maine tends to be conservative, Vermont tends to be liberal, and New Hampshire tends to be libertarian. Live free or die, don't tell me what to do. But all of those states actually got along incredibly peacefully, incredibly happily with one another, and we move back and forth very readily. I feel as comfortable in Burlington, Vermont as I do in Bangor, Maine, and I have no problem visiting the Free Staters down in Keene, New Hampshire, because culturally we are very similar. We agree on the broader idea that there is a social order that should exist, that rightly enacted will lead to better living, and that we agree the right and proper purpose of government is to recognize that order. Now, in the earliest formulations, which came out of Massachusetts, from which much of the Northern ideology derives, even to this day, and that's why the Bay State, despite its relatively small size, has a disproportionate role in politics, as well as the prominent universities which exist there, from Harvard to MIT to Tufts to all the schools that make up that area, and the Ivy League more generally within the Northeast. What ended up happening was that they took the idea that really founded the Northeast, which was that people who were fleeing England went ahead and sought to have liberty as a way to seek grace, right? And they had, you can go back and read the comments in the Mayflower Compact. You can read the many sermons, go read things like the Mather family, and you would find this idea existed that even within a dour culture, the idea was that you had liberty as a means to enjoy the responsibility of saving your soul, and that the purpose of society was to go ahead and create the, how should I put it? It would sound like restrictions to a Westerner, but the tenements of a good society work for the preservation of the people. That we were concerned with order, not in a socialist sense and not in a libertarian sense, but ultimately in the sense that we were going to have a society where good order led to good outcomes, led to better people. And what happened was that Puritanism basically got transformed into transcendentalism. Weird to imagine, but after a while, after living the fruits of a society in grace where people felt confident about themselves, and after the imposition of what was probably more of a Virginian idea, to be honest, in the Bill of Rights, which was a good idea, by the way, liberties that are protected, which we support, that it ended up transforming New England, because we all transform one another. So bring Patrick Henry's ideas of liberty into New England in a formal way, see the falling away of the church, and what happened was people started looking to nature for answers as a step away from looking to God, right? And so transcendentalism said, we're going to look at this world, we're going to apply the rules of liberty, and we're going to try to make this work best to make people happy. And it was that sort of thinking that actually led to the abolition movement, as well as to the ideas of, for instance, women's suffrage, which came out of heavily out of Western New York, actually, is where they're very proud of that. So all of these ideas come together where the idea is no longer that we will try to perfect ourselves to be better before God, but rather that we will try to perfect man in this world and use whatever means necessary. A very, pragmatic New England way of approaching these things that happened to lead to the Civil War, international interventionism, and the creation of the American Empire. People don't understand this because we don't understand the ideas and the roots of our history, where we come from. But that's what the Northeast did. What ended up happening was that the ideas of order became what was known as the North. And what it was that New England became the idea center, the Mid-Atlantic became the administrative center, and the productive force that made it possible was the great wealth, energy, and durability of the good people of the Great Lakes region. Overwhelmingly German, but also including, as time went by, more Italian, Irish stock, whatever, who have never been super political. They've been patriotic, but not particularly ideological. And so all of us support the idea of a good and right social order, and it comes from our European backgrounds and origins. So that was what the Northeast ended up doing. And this became hardened as the lines of American history that ended up happening as of 1860. And when that happened in 1860, that led to the Civil War, which was a war picked by the North against the South to impose a different way of being. And it's an interesting thing because, to be honest with you, the South was going to abandon slavery anyway. They would have had to because it was economically non-viable. Would they have done so differently? Would they have had the same equalities? Who could say? Reconstruction was no friend to the South, whether it be black or white. But that was what was picked in the ideas of the Civil War, not ones I wish to relitigate. I only want to demonstrate what the North was thinking, because now we're going to talk about the South for a minute, with the understanding that the Northern Eastern establishment has been running this country for quite a while. Let's look at your last couple presidents if you need any proof. Donald Trump, 2020, New York. Barack Obama, 2016 for Trump. 2008 and 2012, you're looking at Barack Obama, Democrat, Illinois. You go back before it, George W. Bush. His family comes from Maine, okay? Don't let the fact that he's a Texan fool you. That's where that family's power structure comes from. All right, go back before that. Bill Clinton, Arkansas. Yeah, his wife's family had the power structure. Where they come from. Illinois and New York was where their power structure was. Go back before him. George Bush the Older, Maine family. Go back before him. 88. Reagan is actually different. He's a California cowboy, but that's why they put Bush with him, to limit him. So you begin to see, as you go back further and further, maybe Jimmy Carter's a little different, but you can go back, and see, with the exception of California, which has been a development of East Coasters largely, and we'll talk about how that's different, you can see the overwhelming influence the East has in politics compared to, say, the quote-unquote pragmatic Midwesterners who actually make the country work. And I can lay that out in more detail. But so the money system of the Northeast. America is 3 cities, and I just put it easy this way. It's the administrative center of New York. It's the financial center of New York, the administrative center of Washington, and the logistics center of Chicago, the logistics hub. If those 3 cities disappear, so does America. And, if you understand these things and you start looking at how the country actually works, that's true. But Boston, uniquely in this, serves as sort of the education center, which is a 4th city that really goes ahead. I think America would survive without it, but it would lose its rudder. And that's sort of how the East works. Okay, so enough about the East. So what's the South about? The South comes in there, and Virginia starts being settled by people who were English aristocracy, right? The Cavaliers. And it ends up being a tense combination between people who are kind of brought there to be cheap labor. Think of Oglethorpe's, Georgia, indentured servants, and people from Scotland and the Highlands who go into lower Appalachia especially. Although they're in northern Appalachia, but they get more integrated into the order in the north, where you have the hillbillies of so-called yore in places like Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, and whatnot, as opposed to rednecks, which means, by the way, so hillbillies are people from the hills, rednecks are people who were wearing, their necks got red from being out in the sun. So if you really want to know the difference between hill folk and plains folk, that's the actual origins of those names of things, and I'm not trying to be derogatory to people. The cultural history is fascinating. So what ended up being was there was their elite class, such as it was, were people who tried to go ahead and apply a sort of old Cavalier type system, which was the heart of Virginia and the old, much spoken about Southern nobility that ended up sort of disappearing as time went by. But When you look at the seminal moment in Southern history, it was this idea that, okay, we would have liberty that the Virginians would want, but it was liberty that was going to be for a certain class of people, and it was a lot like what you saw in the imposition of colonialism in the Caribbean and other places, where there was one group of people who did have a set of liberties and that they had an idea of how they were going to run things, and that did not have the chance to fully develop into what Southern liberty might have been, which we don't really know. It could have been a sort of state like Mexico was, where you had heavy racial undertones in how the thing was going to be set up, or it might have been something more idealistic, like Jefferson imagined in his better days, maybe a Jacksonian idea of free ideas. The South didn't get to fully develop itself because ultimately it was agrarian, the North was industrial, they fought a war over it, and the South lost. But the South at that point had its identity shifted, or I should say hardened, maybe is a better word, to an understanding of what the South's key word. In a single word, the South is all about tradition. The South is about doing things the way you did them because your daddy's daddy did them that way, and ultimately too much had to be defended after generations of learning because you were the ones who did this way. To this day, I can go down south and still meet people who refer to this, the Civil War, some 160 years later, as the War of Northern Aggression. And it's not an unfair characterization from their perspective, but my point is, if the North is all about order, the South is all about tradition. And why is that important? Because the South has always gone ahead and done things the way they used to be done because it's how they were. To make an analog, with you to be honest, you see the same sort of dichotomy happen in a somewhat different state, and I know the Canadians always give me a hard time when I do this, but Quebec in a lot of ways is like the South in that sense, where tradition is what defines their people, that they speak French and they have a certain cultural patois that they keep, whereas Ontario and the Maritimes are about order. That's why the Maritimes, despite being the equivalent of New England in Canada, actually go ahead and support the Liberal Party up there, because you're about the order, the dominion of the Queen, and doing things the way you used to do. And the new order might be liberal, it might be progressive, but ultimately it is the order, and therefore it is supported for that reason. And that is what you see as you look up there. So there is an analog in this that I believe works, and if I can find the right Canadian, maybe I'll put him on the air. In fact, if you're out there, by the way, and you are the right Canadian and you want to cover your country, especially from a Northeastern perspective, get in touch with me. I would love an excuse to put it on the air, and I myself will listen, as will many Americans. We want to know more about you, and we don't want to hear it. I always have 2 or 3 people who do this, is tell me how your ideology is brilliant. The show is not fundamentally about ideology. I'm not here talking to you about right or left-wing ideas. I'm here talking to you about cultural ideas that transcend, unite, and divide us in ways that allow us to get out of the left-right paradigm. And that's the problem. We get stuck in these traps of, we did things the way we used to do things, so we have to keep doing them that way, and because others are against us, we have to support things we don't want. It's the Trump voter who's voting to prevent Kamala Harris from enacting punishment. It's the Biden voter who finds that, he isn't the guy they want, but they're scared to death of what Trump would do. And we need a third way to do things. That is the idea behind not just the Atlantic nation, but perhaps an incipient Dixie nation or Western nation or whatever names you want to call them. But to the South, to continue what we were talking about, the thing about the South is, and I say this as someone who's traveled deeply throughout that region and has much love and respect for it, even though it is not my home, that tradition governs the way they live out there to a large extent. They do things the way they do things because they always did things that way, and they got stuck in a rut in history where they were defending ideas without having their own inherent ideology other than tradition, which is to say, we need to do what we need to do. And in that sense, for the South to evolve, I think actually you have to almost reset to 1865 and allow the South to have its own sovereign choices where it can go ahead and decide what it wants to be rather than being a Yankee colony or a place people go within Northern or Northeastern ideology. Your climate is different, where you live is different, how you think is different. It's much more religious. Which makes sense, by the way, that you have the way you have, think of separation of church and state, which was very much a Southern idea that got grafted onto the Northeast with terrible consequences. But down south it works a lot better because the church had certain authorities that were kept to itself as the moral authority, and the state did not claim moral sanction down south in the same way it did, even think of the rallying cries of the Civil War. They were fighting for states' rights. They were fighting for an abstraction of liberty, which to to order seekers in the Northeast had no meaning in the same way. Unless your order directly, as government recognizes and develops the liberties, it doesn't matter. But in the South, it was more of a gradualist evolution. And this is important because as we talk about the West, which is where we're getting to in all this, you're going to see how the West is the unwieldy marriage of Northern and Southern inconsistencies. And to be clear, every country, every culture has these inconsistencies, but you are not taught your history in these schools or in the media, and you don't know where people come from. You have had, whether you are a Southern man, a Yankee, a Westerner, whatever, you have had your history stolen from you because you have had a universalist ideology, a religion, if you want to call it, the woke ideology of Marxism that has just become more virulent in its, third century, being imposed upon you rather than understanding your actual organic history. So, why is that important? When we're talking about the South, what we have is an idea of liberty as much stronger, but that has been subsumed under tradition. So the South says, we are the South, we're going to fight for the South, and in order for the South to advance, it's going to have to move into that idea. And as time has gone by, I would argue, as I have, that the borders of the South and North have shifted a little bit, where the North, because of its successes and because of its population growth and because of people being added, has actually moved well into Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, and I'd say maybe Kansas. I've always said Kansas is our southwestern border. Much love to the fam out there, a lot of people out there who write us. And then south of that, it's something different. Texas and Oklahoma are a border zone between South and West. East of there is the Deep South, and, there are issues there that still haven't been resolved and that are actually, in some ways, brought up as part of our national conversation over and over again, although I do understand these are heavily complicated by immigration policies that, frankly, will be seen historically as insane because they put the idea of economics ahead of culture, and every time you chase the money, well, you end up having the outcome that a prostitute always does. It goes badly. Sad to say, but it is the truth. America became an empire. But now that we've covered the North and the South and the fusion of which created the country, we can talk about the West. And the West is ironic that in the broader sense, I would say that if you took the idea that there was a legitimate order to doing things, okay? And remember, the West is settled after the creation of the Constitution, after the country's developed. You have, if I remember, it's 1803 when Lewis and Clark set off, and really the development of the West starts in earnest in the 1820s and really accelerates to the various gold rushes, 1848, California. All the efforts to move west, the Oregon Trail. All of us probably remember playing that as a kid, shooting the buffalo on a an 8-bit computer way back when, or maybe I'm just nostalgic about my age. But it was the first truly American colony. And why do I say it was an American colony? Because God was taken out of the equation out west. The Southerners believed in God in their churches, but it was nowhere near government. And the Northerners believed in God in their government, but it was removed by the Constitution thanks to the compromise with the Southerners. So when we got out west, we ended up with the first godless society, probably in human history, in Western civilization, at least in a very long time. And why do I say that? Because the northern churches did not carry through the way they would have, but the idea that there was a right and proper order to doing things did. And the southern churches, even though I think they had a little bit more success, also didn't carry through as much, but the idea that liberty was absolute came through. And so you ended up having the West be an amalgam of the North and South. These are the alleles you got in it. The West got this idea that there is a right order that exists in liberty, but that it was independent from any institution to define what that is. So you have two different versions of, if the rallying cry of the North was, order, and the rallying cry of the South was tradition, the rallying cry of the West is individualism. It's don't tell me what to do. And that manifests in two very different ways. You have the libertarianism of the Mountain West, where it is thinly populated, a deliberate ongoing frontier where the way people want to live is they're like, these are my rights, these are my liberties, leave me the hell alone, and I don't want to deal with any of you. Where you literally have a fortress society, which actually makes sense because a lot of steppe societies end up being highly tribal. It's like, they're not going to like this, but it's like what developed in some ways in Afghanistan or the Cossack cultures of Russia. That was it. But on the more pleasant West Coast, in terms of agricultural suitability, not in terms of the people necessarily, that you had something very different exist, which is you had an order based on wealth and comfort that went ahead and said, okay, we are individualism, so we are going to permit absolutely everything and anything. And so the good order ended up being the order which permits everyone to do whatever they want. And this sort of nihilism that we see today, that racks not just Portland, but San Francisco, Berkeley, Seattle, is what happens when you have prosperity minus purpose. And that's what the West is. And I'll say this, I walked in Portland, Oregon last year. I went there, and it's actually a beautiful city, or was anyway, and a beautiful area with a lot of interesting people, but they have no ability mentally to put an idea on others that they are not already familiar with. And they think as individuals, the moral act for us is to let everything happen, to be completely non-judgmental, and that is their order, saying that they are the absolute outcome of well-intentioned individualism absent any higher order. Or as we call it today, in the rest of the sane world, is anarchy. But they cannot help themselves because they've developed that way. And the same thing, in the same trip, I went to Boise, Idaho, my apologies, and I saw the same thing. I talked to a lot of people who leaned right of center who said, Tom, we really don't want to just keep taking more people, but what can we do? It's liberty. We have no way to stop it. And the point is, of course you have a way to stop it. What you realize is responsibility is the logical restriction on liberty, and that government exists to constrain liberties to the extent that it is helpful for the benefit of the majority of people. Now, that message is problematic because there are going to be restraints people don't like. I'm sure murderers don't like being restrained and being thrown into jail. Nonetheless, these restraints are what define civilizations, and the tensions that emerge from them are what develop societies. So when we look out west and we see our schizophrenic children in the West, from the northern obsession with order and the southern obsession with tradition, we have given them our psychoses in such extent that they have an unworkable society. And so the West has to begin to define what it wants for itself very differently than what's been done before, if you all are going to survive. Now, the easiest way to do it, in my mind, that I will tell you, is to get right with God. And in fact, I would argue that the reason why you don't hear me talking about the riots in Los Angeles and San Diego is probably due to the fact that the large influx of Latino population from Mexico and points southward bring the Catholic beliefs forward, where they do have an idea of order, and even if it is a violent order in some ways, where you have gangs, which we saw, by the way, we saw the cartels, not just the cartels, I should say, but the Mexican drug gangs. The people in Chicago told me when things started getting funny, where the riots were being pushed in that community, that it was actually the Latinos who stood up and protected much of the white population. I know this isn't the news you'll ever get, but it makes a lot of sense, because they have a Catholic order, they have a shared background to some extent, and that they have the understanding that violence can be used as a means to enforce order, which is an idea that the Northeast used to support and understand, although we pretend we don't, although we live that way. I always give the joke that the only crime you have in New England is having too high of a lawn, and if you've lived here for too long, you understand that. Or the old joke about the South, why you have two Waffle Houses across the street. There are things that are just understood to people who live or spend significant time in a region that aren't understood elsewhere, and it's these unspoken understandings that make a cultural fabric that are resilient against the sort of inanities of actually believing ideology, because ideologies are just systemic frameworks that are designed to prevent you from thinking about problems rather than actually solving them. But unfortunately, we live in an ideological age of zealotry, and the zealotry we have is not in pursuit of truth or of justice fundamentally, but rather in pursuit of this idea of absolute individual, choice. And the problem is, as has occasionally been opined, what was it said? That heaven is a kingdom and hell is a democracy. And as we move towards a democratic outcome in the wealthiest country in the world, or at least what was, we'll see how it plays out over these next few years. What happens is, as things go badly, we end up fighting one another over the spoils because we have nothing to pull each other together. And so the work we do at Free Atlantic Radio, and the reason we're covering this today, is because I am trying very hard to develop and share with you. And this is a collaborative effort, by the way. It's not just me, although I like to think I've played an important role in the question, is what a good social order looks like. And what we've realized up here in New England, and what I speak to, and what honestly I've been talking with a lot of people with over the last few days, is the idea that putting one order, the old e pluribus unum thing, just doesn't work because we're too different. All these generations removed, it's time for the big family to split up, just like Charlemagne had to do, where France, Germany, and Burgundy, which eventually sort of morphs into a pseudo-Dutch Belgium thing, end up splitting up from the old Holy Roman Empire, which came together as their inheritances. And within this, we have a northern inheritance, we have a southern inheritance, and a western inheritance. And within those inheritances, I would even add further that there's plenty of opportunity for subdivision. I identified the 3 key subdivisions of the North in my mind, not including the Canadians who have their own issues, which if we work with them or apart, because obviously, when we look at Canada, just to talk about the Western Canadians a little bit, because I want you to know I'm thinking about you guys. Manitoba, I'm told, is Winnipeg is Ontario and the rest is Alberta. I very much believe that, not having been there. But as you go through the prairies from, Wild Rose Country over through Saskatchewan and Manitoba, you have that sort of, development later, more individualistic ethic that manifests most heavily in Calgary and Edmonton. And then you go to the West Coast, and then that is British Columbia is to Ontario as California is to New York. It really is that West Coast sort of haven where you have this idea that, you have the order that exists, but it doesn't have the sort of deep tenement roots of it. It's just the recognition that this is the ideological background, and that's why Vancouver, if you actually look at Canadian elections, basically it's Vancouver, Ontario, and the Maritimes, and not all of Ontario. It's actually Vancouver, the Greater Toronto Area, and the Maritimes vote for Liberals, and the rest of the country vote differently. Quebec plays the role of sort of a pseudo-Texas in this thing, where they want to do their own separate thing, and they're kind of the traditionalist that actually Quebec in the Canadian role plays both the South and Texas. It's interesting. And then the West kind of just gets dragged along, and which sucks for Alberta, because you guys actually make a lot of the money for your country, but it's not done because Ontario has the people, and for better or worse, it's the idea center of Canada, even though it's sort of ironic that the counterpoint of that comes from Quebec. And these are sort of similarities, which is why, absorbing the Canadian East into the American North actually removes some of these issues, and I would argue that absorbing the Canadian West into the American West creates more coherent nations for all of us combined. You have the choice to go differently up there, but I talk to you because I actually think about you a lot, and it's very weird that our countries are not together. The War of 1812 probably prevented the union of America and Canada. Weird how these things work out, right? But back to the West for a moment, because the West also got kneecapped in another big way, and this is a big part that, it's really hard to add, but the home... Forgive my cough here, my nose is a little clogged today, but I'll do the best I can. Anyway, the Homestead Act that should have continued, that settled the prairie states of the Midwest, where you saw Kansas and Oklahoma and, Nebraska, places like that developed, or the land purchases that in the first generation where Virginia went into Kentucky and Ohio went into Connecticut. Well, out west, you really weren't permitted that beyond California and the Northwest to a smaller extent. Those people came early, but largely speaking, the creation of the various federal agencies, which really accelerated under Teddy Roosevelt, the BLM, the park system, made whole areas of that region where they were basically owned federal territory, which, by the way, a fair Supreme Court would not have allowed, and it would have given more opportunity for development in the West. Instead, you ended up with this model where you had imperial outposts of the U.S. regime that existed, where you have big cities and not a lot of small towns. Are there exceptions? Absolutely. The Willamette Valley in Oregon, the San Joaquin Valley in California, and there are others. But when you think of the West, you think of big cities, and you think of your Phoenix, your Las Vegas, Seattle, Tacoma, and in all those states over and over again, you see that over 50% of the population is in one city, and that you have this horrible tension that happens because the one big city completely dominates state government and tries to oppress the idea of, an order that exists otherwise. So if you're in Spokane, you're being dominated by the Seattle-Tacoma region, and what happens is that in an ideological war makes it impossible for people to get along because you have absolute individualism on one side manifest as multiculturalism and diversity in the sense of don't tell me what is good versus the other side that is, rugged rural living that is don't tell me what to do. So the two sides are actually a lot more similar than they realize, but they don't know they are because they look at it through this left-right paradigm where they look through glasses at their brothers and sisters that live very near themselves, and they look like monsters. And they are monsters according to the things that they believe, by the way. But it's as simple as changing your belief to fix the West. And if you guys went ahead and had an ideology that was caught up in individualism with some commonly agreed upon good, you would actually be incredibly effective in working with one another. And that's why California and the West have been so productive, because they do in a lot of ways, in fact much more so than I would argue the Northeast or the South, are more efficient, can accomplish more, and can do more individually. But because they are unable to work collectively, they end up wasting a lot of that talent in fighting one another. And as we watch what's happening in Portland, to bring it back, my sort of intellectual ramblings for you, and we see what's happening in Portland, Seattle, and we'll eventually come to San Francisco, by the way, these fights are the ones you'll have to resolve, and you're going to have to find a bigger order to believe in. You're going to have to find something larger than life. And you can pick something. I mean, there are people who want to pick nature as that. I've met them, radical environmentalism, but worshiping trees generally only got you run over in the course of history. And there are people who I know as well who want to make race into religion, and you can have a race war and have a common state that's there, but all you're going to have is an authoritarianism in the end that will end up leading to mass destruction, to being pariahs, because you got to be able to live with people. And I'm not saying you have to import people who don't belong there, but fundamentally a little bit of humanity is what makes the world go around, and there's a reason why big religions and big ideas proliferate, because they allow us to work with one another. And so if you want to exist outside of that, well, you end up having just your own ethnic gods. Well, we've seen what groups of people do like that, and they end up being both persecutors and persecuted. I mean, there is, my friend Kevin McDonald would offer an idea for why that happens that way, actually, where he talks about that in the culture of critique, where when your group decides that your exclusivity of your A religion and B race come together, that you always end up being pariahs unless you have a land of your own. And when you look at these sort of things, then you begin to understand some of the struggles of the Middle East, which is experienced not just by Zionists, but also by certain elements in the Sunni and Shia world. And reenacting the mistakes of the old world does not seem to me a brilliant idea for the new world. Instead, a better order based on the best understanding of God is what I believe. But then again, I am a Yankee New Englander who honors his Puritan tradition with increasing zeal and devotion. And so I look at it that way. Or our Southern friends who will ruthlessly defend their traditions, as much as I might say that you need to move forward. The idea that you be rooted in your identity of who you were, whether you're a Texan, a Tennessean, or a Quebecois, you end up being, at least you know who you are, and starting with an idea that you are something on your own that is unique and important, where you, not individually, but also collectively have value, allows a people to come together and to work for their interest. And even if you have borders, well, that's the way that nations were founded and history has moved forward, because as you might have noticed, nations survive and empires die. The West is the outpost of the American empire. It is a society that was created to recognize the financial interest of others, and leaving aside the California propaganda firms and the fact that Silicon Valley is now an information center, you have to pick what information you're putting out there and understand that the limits of choice. And, people think absolute choice is really a good idea, but absolute choice has its problems, because ultimately you end up giving a lot of sovereignty to the individual, and when you get to difficult choices, you just can't agree on it. For instance, you say murder's bad, okay, but if you're killing 10 people to save 100,000, is that worth it? Well, you might say that's okay, but that's a compromise against an absolute ideology. And having an understanding on the basis on which you're going to make those compromises is really the question that has to be had, and it's kind of the heart of the Atlantic Project. Up here in New England, and in the Northeast generally, we have deliberately, and I will say it, rather than going to talk about liberty or this idea of separation of church and state, what we realized for us to be happy, at least my thought, and this is what I put out there, is that we need an order that reflects our values. So what did I say are our values? Reason. We like to think about questions. We think to the point our ears bleed, and that's something that we like to do up here. Nature. We think we live in a beautiful area, big lakes, big trees, all that, and we need to respect that, but also think how we use it intelligently, how we move forward. Grace. We used to understand in the Northeast the purpose of all of this we were doing was to go ahead and get closer to God, and because we wanted to seek a higher truth. Now we don't talk about higher truths. Well, your truth is not my truth. No, there is a truth. We may not be able to know it, but our job is not to know it, but to seek it. And the seeking of an agreed upon common outcome is what makes people better. It's the root of civilization, that you and I can come together and make something better. A mother and father come together for their kids. Families come together for their community. Communities come together for their state. You see how that works? It is the bonds that we put between us that make it more successful. And grace is what happens with that. And when you have grace, loyalty follows organically. That because of the fact you have blood, kin, and aspirational relationships, you become loyal to one another, and then you have a relationship. So how does that get destroyed, right? When empire is an inversion of the nation, instead of reason, that you are given false appeals to patriotism, right? 9/11, rally around the flag, war with Iraq, you're manipulated left and right where reason isn't used. It's subverted, and you're given lies, and you're made to distrust nature, right? We don't work for the safety of our environment. We don't work for our long-term interests. And the biggest subversion of nature, honestly, in the American system that was imposed upon us, so you understand it, is the idea that we shouldn't defend our families. There is nothing more natural in history than fathers and mothers coming together for their children, and yet you are propagandized every step of the way. You have to go work, don't raise your kids. You have to go be a feminist, don't raise your kids. You have to be, you're not responsible to the woman, don't raise your kids. And why does that happen? Because the state wants to raise your kids, because this model of radical individualism, you can trace it back all the way to Plato's Republic, was always involved one key element: the state had to steal your kids. And when you see when the empire started, okay, we talk about 1910, the Federal Reserve, the Income Tax Amendment, go back to 1890 and see that this church was subverted so that it wasn't considered as morally sound, and that the states got involved with the idea, wouldn't it be nice if we raised your kids? There's nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes tells you this is how it happened in America. Now, for the Northeast, I'm just putting our vision out there. Your visions that would make sense in the West, in the South, and in the subdivisions that may emerge organically have to make sense for you. But I'm telling you how to work the conflict, because I have so many people say, how do I make it work in Oregon? We're good people. How do I make it work in Charleston? We're good people. You are good people. How do you make it work is a question of what can you do together? What will you defend? And what will you agree to impose your ideas on? The Northeast has dominated America because we have had the willingness, rightly or wrongly, arrogantly as we have, to impose our ideas on history. It is an exercise in will in service to a greater ideal. And we didn't necessarily realize we were doing it. That's the sort of dyslexia of American governance, right? That the regions that are going ahead and pushing their ideas treat them as absolute ideals. And America has been, to be clear, an idea state where we have thought, well, our ideas were right. But somewhere in the connection between liberty on the Northeast and order on the South, that what ended up happening was a weird amalgam where you got, two crazy parents out West who left you ideals that you should try to harvest the good from, but now you've reached the point where you need to see things on your own. The East is like Byzantium coming out of Rome. We have to go ahead and build our empire of order differently if we're going to survive. We will be autarkic. We will work along the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Seaways and develop an idea of a good and right order that we need to go ahead and live instead of imposing on others. Instead of being the Pharisees that we've become of the modern age of globalism, multiculturalism, and all that, it's time for our universities to seek a universal knowledge that we will actually live. And only then, when we've spent a good long time figuring out how to actually take care of our own, do we have the right to do that. For the Southerners, my thought, just as an outside observer, which I would not impose upon anyone, is that having defended your traditions, why don't you try to seek the best part of them and develop the ideas of liberty and Christianity in a small community-based church that allows you to heal the long divide that existed between different groups, and that still exists, by the way, in the rural South, but does not exist in your cities. The fact is Atlanta was a place with a lot of violence through this, and I know from having traveled, places like Memphis, Charlotte, Nolens, these places also have those issues that need to be resolved, and how you come together to realize in yourself something unique is something that you'll have to figure out uniquely. But it strikes me that, when I think of a song like An Amazing Grace, and I think of the South and the kindness and the generosity and the hospitality of your people, that you can go ahead and develop your very best thing, which is the nature of how you behave toward others. And if you can have that generosity toward one another, perhaps there might still be something in that. I do understand, I've been talking to my Texian friends, and they tell me that there's a difference between Texians and Texans, and the person who's listening will know who I'm talking to. You guys have always been sort of in between as a mid-center, and you'll have to figure out what it means to be you, what it means, how far north you expand, and this idea that you're going to have to develop more than just liberty and this idea of pride in who you are, and really develop what it means to be a Texan, what the encounter and transformation with the Latino world is, how that fits with your relationship with Mexico, and how you want to live going forward. In the Rocky West, okay, you guys, overwhelmingly, you have an idea of individualism and high capacity. The question is, how do you work together, and how do you build something that is more than a transactional relationship? You, having been used as an economic motor, whether it's cities that were put over there to take things from your goods, or the work that you've taken value from, that you've done in those areas, you need something deeper and something grander, and you'll have to pick what that is and decide for yourself. Look to the Mormons in Utah, as much as I don't necessarily subscribe to their belief. Look what Deseret was able to achieve as a society, because they had a commonality of belief, and that will begin to unite you, where you will be able to repulse ideas. Because remember, all of us keep making the same mistake of thinking that adherence to the law is what's important. Absolutely not. The state is an imposition on the nation, and the nation is an organic group of people who share a common culture, ancestry of blood, language that they work together and work to defend borders, whereby a state is a rational institution that exists to protect those institutions, not one to transform people by radical individualism ideas that is the result of American imperial ideas being pushed into California and coming back at all of us as a nightmare of our own creation. When we looked in the mirror to see our enemy, it was us. Joseph Conrad, The Heart of Darkness. When you stare into the abyss, it stares back. This is what we've had. And to the people out west, to California first, who everyone hates around the country, you guys have been the beneficiaries of all of the best efforts of this country, but you're going to have to realize you have to believe something other than disbelief or believing everything. You're going to have to make hard choices, and I know choosing is not fun for people who live in that part of the world, and yet you'll have to do that, and understand that as you do that and develop a place where people want to be, rather than just enabling and permitting everything and chasing of wealth or information, that you will be the center of a new civilization. And maybe you will be in what I call, to my buddy, you're in the Rome Belt, right? And what do I say by that? In Europe, there's a very big difference between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, right? Northern Europe, Germanic languages, ideas of liberty and collectivism that work as like a Scandinavian society. That goes probably, if you want to draw a map in the U.S., draw a map from the, let's call it the Oregon-California border. It's a little south of that, but that's okay. Across that, and you're in the Rome Belt, where your thing is probably going to look a bit more imperial. Government's going to do a little bit more in some ways in terms of propagandizing, and it's going to be doing quite a bit less in terms of telling people how to live. But nonetheless, you must have a way of understanding yourselves that organizes. And so California has threatened secession from time to time. I've talked about it. People on the right get mad. I don't. And maybe it's because I'm a New Englander who's neither left-wing nor right-wing in truth. I believe leftism works well in towns, and I believe rightism works better at the national level. But I believe that you have the capacity within you to go ahead and organize it for some good if you bother to ask the question, but you haven't been bothered in a long time. Now, for our friends up in the Northwest who write me more than any other, asking the question, what you guys should do, you guys will have to develop an idea that goes ahead and pulls together the Portland to Vancouver corridor in a set of ideas you can agree with to start with, so that you can talk to your people in the inland and convince them you're not utterly batshit crazy. Apologize for the language, but watching how you are surrendering your society to people who are just criminals who are being paid to tear apart your streets is utterly disgusting. So Seattle, no more chop shops. Portland, it's time for you to take back your city. And if you ask for help, by the way, the people who are there, get out of your left-right paradigm. There are plenty of people from Idaho, Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington who would love to help see that happen. And do not let this idea that the federal government has to solve your problems be the answer. Do not let ideology allow you to elect corrupt politicians. Perhaps the answer for the Northwest and for all of our areas is to go ahead and evolve politics where we start putting people in positions of leadership whose loyalty is not to an ideology but to their people. That's what the Free Atlantic Nation does. We posit that we have more in common in Maine with Vermont than we do with Maine and California. Even though ideologically we might vote a certain way, don't let those little blue and red splotches on the map make you forget that you have generations of history, of culture, of environment, of geography to pull your people together in the different areas, and that you need to begin asking these questions and figuring out how to do it. Now, if you want some help on it, go read my New Albion books. It's a model that's made for the Northeast. It's rooted in New England that I think works with some modifications for what we do here. But it's not necessarily that you need to have a model like I have. You need to have a model that makes sense for you, and that's the conversation you need to have. The one thing that New England can give you that's useful is an understanding that law and order only works if it's order and law. The order of what you think is right, which should be what imposes the law. And for the individualists out west, what happens over and over again, and also for the cities, which are now just multicultural imperial melting pots, which don't work for anyone, you're going to have this idea that you're going to have to agree on what's right, and you're going to have to recast your laws. And I will say, this is what you need to understand, and I know this is hard for everyone, but understand that Washington just exists to use you for your utility in pushing ideas around the world at this point. That New York finance sees you as something that you provide money to them, you provide debt servicing, and a situation of control. These are the things you're fighting against, and we know because we are right here in the Northeast. You guys look at these people abstractly. I know New Yorkers, and I know people from D.C., and I know the bad deals that they've made, and we are here trying to be the conscience, the friggin' Jiminy Cricket of the Northeast, trying to tell them that it's time for us to do things differently. But in the same way that California's diaspora is changing the West, you guys in the West, in the South, with your sense of self, can actually help accomplish what we are trying to do here with the Atlantic Nation, and we can all do it as brothers, because if we all agree we're not going to fight for this, whether it be, people up here quoting Thoreau in northern New England, a southern man working his farm, or a Texas rancher, or whether it's, someone up there working in the woods in Oregon, we all can go ahead and say, hey, this doesn't work for us anymore, we're not going to participate. And it's that separation that starts spiritually and mentally. And look, for me, I'm a Christian. I believe that's the way it should be. I believe that's the way it has to be, because I believe not only is it our truth, but it is the truth. But without truth, there can be no goodness. Without that, there is no order, and law becomes an imposition upon people. So when you ask the law to defend you, and when you ask for our national mythology, which is the Constitution is what sets us free, no, the Constitution never did a thing. It was a set of words made by people who understood that freedom was something that good government supported. And so you have to understand what the purpose of freedom is and how it's defended well before you count on laws to save you, because laws will only ever be the means by which you are oppressed by other men. That's why Christ said, render unto Caesar what's Caesar's and render unto me what is mine. The law is not the order. The order of righteousness is beyond the law. And as Christ was grace that superseded the law, in the same way, we must become graceful to one another in our individual nations to supersede the law which holds us down within this empire by which, let us be honest, much bad has been done in the world, even though it's of good intent, because we have tried to go ahead and impose an idea. In this, the multiculturalists are actually a little correct. We have tried to impose ideas on others, but we're still doing that. The leftists in the streets do it more than anyone, other than the imperialists in Washington. And hey, I just want to be free to live how I want to do, to be as judgmental and arrogant as I want, to seek Christ in my life, and be a Yankee, who lives up here in King Arthur's court, and that's what we're trying to do up here in the Northeast. So maybe this episode will give you an idea of a different way to understand your relationships to one another in history. And you'll notice I didn't attack any race of people. I didn't attack any specific left or right-wing belief. Look, communalism has value. Responsibility has value. Why don't you pull what's good, get rid of what's bad. And I would suggest for the right, the ideas of responsibility, of respect for authority and tradition have value. The idea that you're going to sell everything out because you want to quantify things to justify it isn't. Look, the world is messy. Accept it. We'll go forward with that. For the leftists, the idea that you want to go ahead and have people be treated with respect and have communities that care is not a bad idea. But remember, it is not good enough to make the mistake that New England made over and over again of imposing these ideas on others and saying you can not only, that you have to believe that everything is equal to everything else. You're smarter than that. Stop being so stupid. And if the colleges literally made you that dumb, go live in the real world for a little bit, talk to people, understand the way the world works. That's what we do here in the Atlantic Nation. We go ahead and we present ideas as they actually are and take it from someone who's been at the top and at the bottom. I've rubbed elbows with billionaires, and I've been in squalor that you wouldn't even believe. And you'd be surprised which one I like more. It's not always the ones who have the most stuff, but it's the ones who have the best ideas. And that we go forward as a land of ideas. It's time for us to bring our best ones forward, or we will destroy one another. If we want to have the Civil War, we'll end up in the same place eventually, just a lot poorer, maybe dominated by foreigners and having a lot of other issues. So as we march toward November with, the perilous and ominous beat of two sides fighting against one another, I would remind you the option exists when that happens and both sides want to fight. Let them fight each other and the rest of us walk away. We'll be here to visit you up in northern New England because Lord knows that's what our people are going to do. And for the Texans who, have been wanting that, for the South, who's going to be asked to fight a war against California. For the Californians who are going to just want separation, all of us could be either happy apart or be forced together, And if we were happier apart, then maybe, just maybe, we could have a conversation where our ancestral grievances aren't what defines this empire becoming nations. And that's a good thought. I'm reading from Genesis 11:5. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building, and this is the Tower of Babel. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it's called Babel, because from there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the earth. The Tower of Babel was an effort to go ahead and give the idea that man could be God. And that the reason it was scattered is because it was a blasphemy to think that we could ever manage a perfect utopia. Instead, we can live in harmony and seek something where government is not the answer to all of our problems. For those of us who have come to think that the state exists to impose its ideas on man as an absolute without any understanding that morality is absent from the state is just a vehicle, the Lord reminds us in that message through his own actions in dispersing us to our many languages. We're not meant to live that way. Perhaps an American revival understands that we are not meant to be one empire growing across the world as a global hegemon, destroying the very virtue that made us once wonderful. It's a thought to have as we go into prayer. Heavenly Father, I pray for the people of this land, whether they be in the West, the South, the North, or even Canada, the far North, that we go ahead and have the wisdom to speak to one another, to seek your truths, and with kindness and gentility, remember the admonition of the Lord our Savior that said that you must love your neighbor as your enemy. That we must learn to love one another again. And in order to love one another, we must understand each other. But we cannot understand each other unless we understand ourselves. So I pray for the wisdom of the Holy Spirit to speak to all people listening in this program and help them find that truth, and that your voice will be heard by all of them, as I know you speak to each of us. So in Jesus' name I pray that. Amen. Thank you very much for another episode of Free Atlantic Radio. I will be back on Friday. I suspect we will be talking about the urban diaspora and what it means, because we're going to have to talk about how we deal with people coming who don't belong. The old Southern saying, you ain't from around here, boy. And we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the real issues that are out there. So we'll talk about the big and the small, but that's what we're going to do. We're going to keep talking. We're going to keep listening, and Lord willing, all this talking I'm doing will have some utility for some of you, and maybe make the future a little less miserable for all of us, because I think things are going to get worse before they get better. But if they're going to get worse, let's make sure that at least we do what we can to try to make it better for the rest of us. God bless each and every one of you. Tom Kaczynski out.